So I got a comment recently asking me to share my top palettes this year for 2024, like an updated video, and it had a lot of thumbs up. So I thought I would film this for you because it's been interesting. Over the last year, I haven't purchased a ton of palettes. So because of that, I feel like I've really been focusing on a lot of older formulas, a lot of palettes that I've had in my collection for a while, and I've been able to narrow it down to my absolute staples. So I wanted to share the best of the best, the formulas I love the most, the color stories I use the most often, and I'm going to rank them from 12 all the way up to 1. Now, keep in mind, even the palettes at the bottom of the list are still my absolute favorites because I'm sharing all of my top palettes. The ones at the top of the list are just kind of the ones that I reach for the most, the color stories and the formulas that I love a little bit better than the ones at the bottom. So I hope you enjoy today's video. Okay, so coming in at number 12 is definitely an older favorite. I've had this palette for years. Actually, this is not the original palette I had. I repurchased it maybe like a year ago because mine was getting pretty old, but it is the ColourPop Going Coconuts palette. So this palette, might kind of strike you as a little bit of a boring palette compared to what ColourPop has available right now. But at the time when they launched this, I feel like it was when all of the neutral palettes were so orangey, so red, so warm toned on the eyes. And sometimes you wanted a neutral eyeshadow look and you didn't want something so warm toned on the eyes. So when ColourPop came out with this, I feel like it was a staple for so many people. At the time, they made my favorite eyeshadow palette formula, and I do still really enjoy their formula. There are just other formulas I tend to reach for a little bit more, which is why they're not quite at the very top of my list. But I have used this palette for years. It has a lot of staple matte neutrals. It has some great metallic shadows in it. And even though it's not like a completely neutral leaning palette, it is so much less warm toned than a lot of the other palettes we were seeing at the time. I feel like this color story has aged really, really well. I just used it last week. It's something I still reach for all the time, and I really enjoy having it in my collection. If you're someone who doesn't want anything too orangey or too cool toned, this is a great option, especially if you love really intense metallic shadows. I'll swatch everything for you just so you can see what the shadows look like. At number 11, I have another ColourPop palette. This one is That's Taupe. I do like this color story a little bit more. I find the quality to be pretty similar, but there's just something so beautiful about this palette. I actually just repurchased this palette maybe last month because, again, mine was getting pretty old at this point. It is really beautiful if you love a cool toned color story, but you also love like a little bit of a rosy tone too. And even not like fully rosy, some of these shadows look a little bit purpley on the eyes, which I personally love. Again, I feel like this color story has aged so well because cool tone palettes are really trendy right now. And if you're looking for a beautiful cool toned color story, but you don't want to spend a ton of money, this is such a perfect option. You can get a lot of different looks out of this 9-pan palette, including something that does pull really neutral, something kind of silvery and gray toned, something a little bit more purpley. You can go really light and soft if you reach for the top part of the palette, or really dramatic with this row right here. And then this shadow right here is a Super Shock, and the Super Shock just makes everything have like that beautiful glistening wet look. So here's what they look like side by side. I also think they pair really nicely together, but I do tend to like this color story and reach for it a little bit more than Going Coconuts, which is why I ranked it just a little bit higher. Natasha Denona definitely makes a lot of my favorite palettes. You'll see a few more in today's video, but when it comes to her mini palettes, I have to say this one is my absolute favorite. It's the Mini Retro. It actually came out way before the mid-size retro palette, which I love as well, and the color story is a lot different than that one. I think based on this, a lot of people thought the mid-size retro palette would look very different, but I really love this color story. When you first look at it, it might not look the most interesting, but what really pulled me in is I saw people doing looks with this, and the looks they created looked different than I thought they would based on the shadows in the palette. So for example, the first shade in here is described as a neutral duochrome. I thought it was going to be like a metallic pink, and it really doesn't look like that on the eyes. So when you combine it with this silver and this gray here, you just get a really beautiful, wet looking smoky eye. I also love these pinks, especially this one right here, because it's not super pink on the eyes. You can almost use it like you would use like a neutral transition shadow. So I just think it's a lot of fun to play with. I love using this on its own. Even though it only has 5 shadows, I feel like I can get a few different looks and also like a really stunning, beautiful smoky eye or something kind of subdued and more natural. So I think it's a really versatile palette, especially for only being like a little mini, and I reach for this one all the time. Okay, number 9, I do have a Huda Beauty palette. Huda Beauty palettes are definitely some of my favorites. This is the only one in my ranking though, because as much as I love them, I feel like I don't tend to reach for them as much as other formulas, even though the color stories are so unique, so interesting. Mercury Retrograde Oh my gosh, Mercury retrograde is still one of my favorite color stories. Not my most used at this point, but definitely still one of the most interesting color stories I own. Anyway, number 9 is the Naughty Nude palette. This is still available on the Huda, oh my gosh, okay. This is still available on the Huda Beauty website, but it's not on Sephora's website. And the mini retro palette from Natasha Denona isn't on Sephora's website any longer either. But you can get the mini retro at Ulta. So I just wanted to point it out because I feel like sometimes if they're not available at like the big retailers like Ulta and Sephora, they can kind of like fly under the radar, but this is still such a gorgeous color story. So if you love like chocolatey browns, kind of berry toned browns, this is going to be a perfect option for you. Something I love about the Huda Beauty palettes is you tend to get a lot of different finishes and a lot of different formulas within one palette. So of course you get your staple matte shadows and your staple metallics. That's kind of what makes up the majority of this palette, but you also get some really beautiful reflective marble creams. You get something that they call a hypnotic marble cream. They did like this gloss with bronze and berry pearls in it, which isn't really my personal favorite, but I definitely applaud them for doing something a little bit different. I really like Huda Beauty's matte shadows because I find them to be very buildable. So, you know, with Natasha Denona and a few other brands, you dip into those matte shadows and you get a ton of pigment right away, which can be really nice depending on your preferences or the type of look you're going for. But sometimes you want something a little bit softer that you can slowly work up to be more intense. And that's what you get from Natasha or from Huda Beauty palettes. I'm sorry, I swear my brain is all over the place today. So when you're reaching for some of these darker mattes, especially like these berry toned browns, if they were in a different formula from another brand, they might have a tendency to look really patchy as soon as you apply them to the eyes. But because they are a little bit of like a lighter, fluffy, airy formula, you can slowly build them up and not really have to worry about them being too pigmented or too patchy right off the bat. So I definitely enjoy this palette a lot. I will say this palette applies a lot better to the eyes than it swatches, especially the matte shadows. I feel like her metallic shadows really are so beautiful, one of her standout formulas. They're really intense and wet looking, but unlike Natasha Denona, they're a little bit lighter. So again, very easy to apply to the eyes without feeling too heavy or too intense. Okay, coming in at number 8, this is a newer palette to me. I actually just bought this during the Sephora sale, but I feel pretty confident ranking it in my top palettes because I was familiar with the formula before I decided to try it out. It's the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 3, the matte palette. So this comes with a range of fully matte shadows and then 2 creams as well, just like the other Patrick Ta palettes. Now, what I love about this is that it has a mix of warm tones and cool tones, but either, like both rows don't lean so far in one direction that you can't use them together. This is the type of palette that's perfect if you don't want it to look like you're wearing a ton of eyeshadow, because you can do something really soft and natural, or you can do something really dramatic. I actually like the cream shadows in here because I do end up using them as liner quite often. I feel like they complement this palette really nicely, and then I'll just kind of go in with a little bit of powder shadow to set them down. I do think Patrick Ta kind of improved his eyeshadow formula with this one. I've tried the mattes and the other two, and I do like those palettes a lot, but there's something about this formula that's just like extra creamy, extra smooth, really blendable. It is a pretty light, powdery, again, like very airy formula, so you can do something a little bit lighter and softer, but it's really easy to build this formula up. It doesn't look patchy or uneven on the eyes, and I just think it's the perfect complementary palette to anything in my collection, whether I'm using like a single shadow on top, like a ColourPop shadow or something from Urban Decay, or I'm using this alongside of another palette that's missing like 1 or 2 of my staple matte shadows. This has come in handy so much. So again, there is the possibility that it could rank a little bit higher, maybe a year from now. I just, again, have only been using it for a few weeks, so I wanted to be fair and kind of rank it just a little bit lower, but I feel like it will be one of my most used palettes, just at the rate that I'm already reaching for it. Okay, so at number 7, I actually have 3 palettes that I wanted to share with you. These 2 mini palettes are kind of based on this one, so let's first talk about this. It is the Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette. Now, this is a little bit of an older launch. Again, this is not the original palette I had in my collection. I actually decluttered it and then I tried it again a few years ago, and I loved the formula so much. One of the reasons why I like this palette is because I feel like they just set it up in a way that's very easy to use. If you're someone who gets very overwhelmed overwhelmed by eyeshadow palettes and you don't know which shades to pair together, something like this is really nice because you can just reach for a duo. If you want a very simple look, you can just take the matte shadow and then the metallic on top, and that works all the way across the palette. Or you can reach for it in quads. So you can do this quad right here, or you can do this quad right here, this quad right here. You get the point. It just makes it very simple and it's very easy to combine colors and shadows that are really complementary. On top of that, this formula is just very easy to work with. So they set it up in a way that's easy to use, but they also made a formula that just blends out super quickly. This matte formula is very thin, again, very buildable. I do have some very rich matte shadows that I love that I'll talk about soon in the video, but if I'm doing like a quick, easy look, this is the formula I love. But the metallics in here are a little bit more intense. They're very vibrant. So I feel like that's what kind of kicks it up a notch. Instead of being like an underwhelming shimmer formula that's just kind of, so-so on the eyes, these shimmers look amazing every single time. They're kind of on the thicker side. They almost feel like a little bit gritty, but that's why they look so good because they catch the light in the most perfect way. So I absolutely love this. I know they have another version of this. I forget the exact name. I'll put a picture of it on the screen. I actually haven't tried that one. I felt like the color story was kind of similar to other palettes I owned, so I'm not sure if that formula is the same or not. I'm kind of tempted to try it just because I love this one so much, but I will say just a few months ago, Too Faced came out with these 2 mini palettes. Maybe not even a few months ago, maybe just a few weeks ago. These are like the mini version of this. This one specifically is very, very close. So if you already own this, I wouldn't recommend picking up the Warm Ember Nudes palette because it's not going to look a lot different. If you want a smaller version of this, this might be the answer for you, but I swatched them right next to each other in the past and the colors are almost spot on identical. So just wanted to point that out. That being said, I do really like the Cold Smolder Nudes palette because this one is a cool toned version. So it's the same formula as the original, but it has beautiful silvery taupey shadows in it that you don't really find in this palette. There are maybe like 1 or 2 shadows that come kind of close, but for the most part, this palette is very warm toned. So I've actually been loving this so much. I have an entire video where I use this. So if you want to see what it looks like, I'll link it below, but I'm a big fan of this. So I just wanted to mention this in case you've seen these on Sephora's website. The formula is not new. It's almost the exact same as the original palette. And this color story is almost identical, but this one really is, it's different. It's cool toned. It's beautiful. If you need a small go-to cool toned smoky palette, this is the one. Let's talk about a few of my favorite drugstore palettes. So at number 6, I have this simple little quad from e.l.f. I will say that e.l.f. has a lot of great color stories within their bite-sized eyeshadow palette line, and they all come with 4 shadows, but this is one of my most used palettes of all time. I've actually repurchased this like 3 or 4 times at this point, maybe even more than that, because I always hit pan on the first 3 shadows. It just comes with 4 staple matte shadows, and this probably won't be for everyone, but I feel like these 4 shadows come in handy all the time. Now that I have the Patrick Ta palette, I feel like I could probably use that one in place of this too, but there's something about these tones. I feel like they are kind of perfect for my skin tone. I'll use this palette to create like a full eye look and then take a shimmer all over the lid, or I'll just use 1 or 2 of the shadows along with other palettes in my collection. It's a little bit more of a powdery palette, which I actually think is perfect because sometimes I feel like if my eyeshadow is looking a little bit patchy, specifically like right in this area, if I take a really powdery shadow and just layer that on top and kind of blend over the edges, it just makes everything look really smooth, which is what I use this shade for all the time. So I love this. I feel like it's an easy staple palette. I bring it with me every single time I travel. If I'm in a hurry and I don't have time to do a lot of eyeshadow, but I still want to wear it, which is most days, I'll take one of these shadows in the crease, a shimmer all over the lid, this on the brow bone, sometimes this is liner, and I'm good to go. And number 5, I had to mention the Flower Beauty palettes. I think there are 4 different options at this point. My absolute favorite is still Desert Lights. This is one of the highest quality palettes I've ever tried. I don't use this palette quite as much as I might use a palette that has like mattes and metallics in it because this is a fully shimmer palette. So I never do like a fully shimmer look. You obviously can do that, but I always kind of start my look with matte shadows. So that's why I don't use this one quite as much as the palettes at the very top of my list. But this quality quality is so good. These are a little bit more expensive for drugstore palettes, and I feel like some people kind of hesitate because you only get 6 shadows. But I am telling you, this feels like a luxury formula. I even like this better than some of my Natasha Denona metallic shadows within my different palettes because this looks so rich, so beautiful on the eyes. It's very intense, really gorgeous. I'll just show you what the swatch is. I'll also swatch Coastal Lights for you. Coastal Lights is a little bit more subtle. Like some of the shadows in here lean kind of like satin rather than full on metallic. But again, they still look really vibrant on the eyes. Very, very smooth, so gorgeous. And they really add like the perfect pop to any look. Even though they're around like the $20 price point, Flower Beauty does go on sale on Ulta's website multiple times a year. So you can probably get like 30–40% off these eyeshadow palettes if you just wait. But even at that $20 price point, I do think it's worth it because the quality is that good. Like these are so rich, so intense and vibrant. If I had this quality in like my higher end palettes, I wouldn't even question it. Like this really does beat so many of my higher end shadows. I almost feel like those palettes could be swapped with this one for positions, but I don't know. It was kind of hard to rank them because these really are like a lot of my favorite, or they're all my favorite staple palettes. But at number 4, I did put the, or wait, is this 4? Yeah, I guess we're already at number 4. The Patrick Ta Major Dimension 1. I do use this palette more than I use the Flower Beauty palettes, which is why I think I ranked it just a little bit higher because this one does come with really beautiful metallics as well as gorgeous matte shadows. I have hit pan on 2 of the shadows, which I feel like is pretty good for me because I do have a larger, more extensive eyeshadow palette collection. I'm constantly switching it up. So for me to hit pan on shadows means that it truly is like an absolute staple for me. Again, this is a palette that I will bring with me when I travel because it just has like very easy, simple shadows for quick makeup looks, something a little bit more dramatic. I do tend to use these creams as bases, well, mainly for these 2 shadows right here, but I do love this, especially when I want more of a warm toned look. The matte shadows, like I mentioned with the other Patrick Ta palette, are very creamy, super easy to use, but I love the metallics in here because they just give your eyes that very wet looking appearance. The metallics are kind of creamy as well. Like they are metallic shadows, but this one right here is my favorite because it just gives your eyes like that wet looking appearance. So I have used this one a ton. It is a little bit older, but mine still works great. I know some people have said they've had issues with their Patrick Ta palettes going bad pretty fast. A lot of people ask like, how do I know if my eyeshadow palettes expire? Should I get rid of them? The shelf life that brands recommend is pretty short. And obviously you can do whatever you want, but there are a few kind of obvious signs. I mean, if you look at your palette and there's mold in it, get rid of it. Like don't even question it because your eyes are very important. Your whole face is important and you don't want to be applying moldy makeup. And I have heard people say their Patrick Ta palettes have grown mold quickly. Again, that hasn't been my experience, but another sign is if the formula changes, if the texture changes, the color, the scent, if anything is a little bit off or different, it's probably a sign that it has expired. I don't come across a ton of expired palettes in my collection, but I do declutter because I used to bring in a ton of palettes, so I would probably get rid of them before they would end up expiring on me anyway and just pass them along to someone else. There is a way to kind of disinfect your palettes. I know makeup artists do it all the time. You just spray some alcohol on them and that can obviously help. But if your palette is growing mold, don't even mess around. Contact Sephora or the brand if you want a refund if it hasn't been a very long time, but it is something to look out for. Okay, we made it to the top 3. I feel pretty confident about my top 3 palettes. I was kind of moving them around, but for the most part, these were the ones at the very top of my list. Number 3 is the Natasha Denona Yucca palette. Now, I won't say this is my most used palette because of the color story. I do love colorful eyeshadow looks, but for the most part, I don't reach for this one quite as often as the other palettes I mentioned. But this is such a stunning palette, both the color story and the formula, that I have to rank it super high because I'm blown away every single time I use this. I love green eyeshadow so much, and I do love color. It's not something I wear all the time, which is why a lot of these palettes, most of these palettes do tend to lean very neutral. But when I want to reach for a colorful palette that I know performs perfectly, that looks so stunning every single time, this is the one. You obviously have to like color to like this palette. You you have to like green eyeshadow because those are the main looks you'll get using this. You can get a little bit more of a neutral look if you just reach for like the metallics and maybe like one of these shadows in the crease or something a little bit more orangey, or you can pair it with another palette and do something more toned down. But I love the rich greens in here. I will say this palette can be a little more difficult to blend out because these shadows are so rich and intense, and sometimes they can look slightly patchy if you don't really take your time blending them out or building them up. But overall, I'm so blown away by this. The shimmers in here, the metallics in here are so wet looking, so rich, so vibrant. I feel like this is one of her best palettes in terms of color story and formula. It's just so interesting and unique. And if you want to try Natasha Denona, but you aren't necessarily into her more neutral palettes, you want something that's a little bit more fun, I highly recommend this one. I feel like it really is so gorgeous. Okay, number 2 is Patrick Ta yet again. So all 3 of the Patrick Ta palettes made it into my top palettes video, and I really do love them. Over the past year, I used Major Dimension 1 and Major Dimension 2 so much that I actually ended up purchasing the 3rd one this year, especially after I was kind of like, I don't really need it. I just really fell back in love with this specific formula, and I love the way it looks. I love that you have everything you need in one palette as far as really high quality matte shadows and really beautiful metallic shadows, and then also gorgeous creams. I'm not generally the biggest fan of cream shadows, but there's something about this formula that works so well as a base to his metallic formula that I do end up using these quite a bit. There were some mixed opinions on this palette. I think a lot of people thought it was going to be a little bit less orangey, less red, less pink than it is. And I know I said the reason why I like some of the other palettes in today's video is because they're not orangey or red toned. But if that is the type of look I'm going for, this is the palette I'm reaching for because it is so beautiful. This color story is stunning. Every single time I use it, I feel like it comes together in the most beautiful way. And this is kind of like a special occasion palette for me. Like I definitely use it to create more everyday looks for sure. But if I'm going to like a wedding or like a date night or just something like fun and special, this is the palette that I'll reach for because I love the way the looks come together every single time. I think it's so stunning, so beautiful, and I just love it. I really can't get enough of it. I was really hoping that Major Dimension 3 was going to be like a cool toned version of that with like beautiful, cooler, silvery, even blue toned sparkling metallics, and then really rich matte shadows. And that I think is the reason why I was a little bit underwhelmed by Major Dimension 3 when it first launched. And I still hope he does like this beautiful, smoky, silvery blue, cool toned version because I will buy it immediately. Okay, so that brings us to number 1. This might not be a surprise to you if you've been around my channel, but it had to go to the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. I don't think I've ever worn any palette as much as I have this one. Maybe that like e.l.f. quad because I do use that one quite a bit, but this is my favorite eyeshadow palette of all time. I'm wearing it today. I really wear it like every single chance I get. When I first purchased this, I mean, even over like the last few months, I had to make a conscious effort to put this away so I could reach for other palettes in my collection because I really wanted to wear this every single day. Looking at this palette, I know that a lot of people aren't necessarily like super blown away by the color story, which I definitely understand, but when I saw this, I was like, that is the palette of my dreams. I love a good neutral palette. I love Natasha Denona's like wet looking sparkly shimmers, and I love when my neutral palettes have like a little bit of a rosy hue to them because I love pinks, but I don't always want to wear like a full-on pink look, kind of like the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 2. So I feel like this palette kind of incorporates like a little bit of pink, some like very subtle purpley tones while still pulling mainly neutral and pretty cool toned on my eyes. I do have this on my eyes today, so I can't remember exactly. I know I have this one, and this one kind of blended into the crease, and then this one in the outer corner, this one all over the lid with a little bit of this on top. And you know, when I use this palette, I do feel like a lot of my looks end up looking kind of similar, but they vary in depth. So they can be like very light and soft or a little bit more dramatic and smoky, but every single time I use it, I feel like I get like that beautiful wet looking glow that I'm wanting from every other palette. It's like Natasha Denona took what could have been like a very boring color story and just elevated it by changing up the formulas and the textures and creating something that pulls together so perfectly every single time. I will say if I was you know, redesigning this palette myself, I'd probably take out this shadow and this shadow because I don't use them a ton, and I'd put something else in there that's a little bit different. I might even go with more of a pinky purple tone like this in one of the spots, and then maybe like more of a mid-toned brown that kind of falls between these two. Or even like a little bit of a purpley brown, kind of similar to what you might find in the Naughty Nude palette. That might have complemented it really well. So part of me is kind of tempted to like pull two of the shadows from my Natasha Denona Glam palette and stick those in these two spots because I feel like I'd get more use out of them. And maybe I'll do that and just kind of try it out and try something different. But I love it so much. It is so beautiful. Again, expensive, but if you can get it on sale, Natasha Denona does run site-wide sales. You can wait and use like a 20% off coupon at Ulta because Natasha Denona is available at Ulta, or wait for like a Sephora savings event. But I do recommend that palette so much if you're into like elevated neutrals. So that's everything for today's video. Let me know in the comments below what your top favorite palette is of all time. I would love to hear from you. I'm so curious to know what people are using because I know eyeshadow palettes as a whole aren't quite as popular these days, but I do still love eyeshadow. I reach for mine all the time. So let me know what you're reaching for as well. And I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye.